Professor Brent Edwards, another one of my buddies, and I might say that he and I talk in particular about problems of translation, which he'll tell you how he's going to develop that, but it's a bit of a departure from what we've been doing, I expect. He's a BA from Yale, 1990, master's from Columbia, 1992, PhD from Columbia, 1998. He's the author of a very important book called The Practice of Diaspora, Literature Translation and the Rise of Black Internationalism, Harvard Press 2003, awarded the John Hope Franklin Prize of the American Studies Association, the Gilbert Chinard Prize, Gilbert Chinard Prize of the Society for French Historical Studies, and runner-up for the James Russell Lowell Prize for Modern Language Association. With Farah Jasmine Griffin and with me, he co-edited a book called Uptown Conversation, The New Jazz Studies, Columbia Press 2004. He has many essays and articles on topics including African-American literature, Francophone literature, theories of the African diaspora, Black radical intellectuals, cultural politics in Paris of the 20s and 30s, surrealism, 20th century poetics, and jazz. His translations include essays, poems, and fiction by authors including Edouard Glissant, Jacques Derrida, and Jean Baudrillard. He's co-editor of the journal called Social Text, and serves on the editorial boards of Transition and Callaloo. He's currently working on two book projects, a study of the interplay between jazz and literature in African American culture, and a cultural history of the jazz scene in New York of the 1970s. He's my beloved friend and beloved colleague, Brent Edwards.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to Bob for inviting me here and bringing me here. It's really nice to be back here. I taught at Reed Hall last fall a year ago, and it's nice to see and be able to chat and catch up with some old friends and even some old students. Bob asked me to talk about relations among the arts and to speak a little more generally about what it means to think about relation among the arts in relation to something like Bearden's series, which is, after all, a work in the realm and the medium of visual art responding to a work of literature. So my little talk, now I'll try to keep it under control because I see we're already running way over. It's called Sea Changes, Bearden Across Media. The often heard cliche that talking about music is like dancing about architecture is perplexing, not only because its source remains so resolutely mysterious. The phrase has been attributed to Thelonious Monk, William Burroughs, Frank Zappa, Martin Mull, Laurie Anderson, and Elvis Costello, among others, but also because it seems to take for granted that it's ludicrous, if not impossible, to use one expressive medium to comment on or respond to another. On the contrary, as a number of critics have argued, one way to chart the formal innovations of modernism is to note the ways that artists have continually found instigation and inspiration in other media. Whether one thinks of Debussy and Nijinsky reading Mallarmé, or Pollock listening to Charlie Parker, or Mondrian noting the patterns and energy implied by the Manhattan streetscape. And although I'm not going to show you very many images, I can give you two examples of dances that I think are indisputably about architecture. If you want to know what it means to dance about architecture, here's Trisha Brown's 1971 roof piece. And you see the dancers across roofs from, I think it's from Crosby up to Houston in Soho. You see the dancer in the background of the image and the dancer in the foreground of the image exchanging gesture vocabularies by a kind of semaphore across rooftops. Certainly nothing if not dancing about architecture. Or another example, William Forsythe's 2000 piece, One Flat Thing Reproduced, which is a thrilling, even frightening, great work of choreography premiered with the Frankfurt Ballet at the turn of the millennium, in which the dancers dance among and over and under 20 metal tables. about the craziest thing you can do as a modern dancer. Today I want to outline a few ways of thinking about approaches to the comparative arts, to relation among artistic media, not only because they're so obvious at stake in Bearden's Odysseus series, as a series of collages that are responses to elaborations of or encapsulations of episodes in Homer's Odyssey, that is, visual art that responds to literature, but more broadly because these issues are so crucial in the modern history of the arts, and perhaps especially in the history of African diasporic art. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that African-American art practices have taken shape in relation to music in particular. Black literature, for instance, is thoroughly informed by the conviction that music is the privileged archival medium of Black communal experience, that music provides a tone parallel, in Duke Ellington's phrase, to African-American history. The idea that the music contains not only emotional surges and rhythmic propulsion, but also commentary and insight, even lucid critical analysis, can be traced at least as far back as Frederick Douglass's musings in his first 1845 narrative of the meaning of the wild songs, as he calls them, sung by slaves on the plantation, songs in which he says, quote, "The thought that came up came out, if not in the word, in the sound, and as frequently in the one as in the other." Or in W.E.B. Du Bois's description in The Souls of Black Folk of the spirituals as the, quote, "naturally veiled and half-articulate message of the slave to the world." The most eloquent version of this common claim may be the opening of James Baldwin's 1951 essay, Many Thousands Gone. Quote, "It is only in his music, which Americans are able to admire because a protective sentimentality limits their understanding of it, that the Negro in America has been able to tell his story. It's a story which otherwise has yet to be told and which no American is prepared to hear." I'm going to dwell a bit on this point because it's clearly at stake throughout Bearden's work in the Odysseus series and elsewhere. As Theodore Adorno points out in a late essay, painting is above all a spatial art. And the reworking of space that's achieved in a painting is a matter of its dynamization and negation. Paintings are most successful, he says, when they create an effect in which, quote, "what is absolutely simultaneous seems like a passage of time that is holding its breath. This, not least, is what distinguishes painting from sculpture." This is an effect not of consonance or stasis, but instead must involve tensions, Adorno says, among the elements of the artwork. Tension, however, he adds, can in no way be conceived without the element of the temporal. It's no coincidence, then, for him that there is such a prevalence of musical tropes, harmony, color dissonance, in discussions of painting. In painting, the tension within the momentary cannot be named otherwise than musically, that is, with temporal expressions. In Bearden's Odysseus series, even if the primary intermedial link involves poetry and painting, nonetheless, one has the impression that there's always somehow at least three media at play: poetry, painting, and music, in a manner where music seems to provide the formal models for a continual transposition between writing and collage, in which that transposition takes the form of improvisation. One of the more compelling recent overviews of comparative arts is Daniel Albright's 2014 book, Panesthetics. Against thinkers who would erect strict distinctions among artistic media, the lineage of medial separatists from Lessing, who contended that the temporal arts, such as music and literature, had protocols wholly different from those of the spatial arts, such as sculpture and painting, or Clement Greenberg, the art critic, who famously proclaimed that, quote, to restore the identity of an art, the opacity of its medium must be emphasized. Daniel Albright argues provocatively that, and this is the summary of his argument of the entire book, an artwork is an artwork precisely because it's especially susceptible to translation into an alien medium, and because those translations have a certain captivating aspect. Moving among a range of examples in European literature, painting, and music, Albright examines the varieties of intermedial art, and by intermedial he means the imaginary artwork generated by the spectator through the interplay of two or more media. So if you're watching an opera, you're hearing music, you're seeing bodies on stage, and you're listening to text being performed, as well as what he terms, after Adorno, pseudomorphosis, that is, a work in a single artistic medium where the medium is asked to ape or to do the work of some alien medium. Now, Bearden's Odysseus series is not really either precisely intermedial art, as Robert O'Meally points out in the catalog essay. In none of these cases did Bearden's paintings serve as illustrations to Homer's words any more than the writer's words served as mere captions for Bearden's art, nor is it pseudomorphosis, since the paintings depict certain key episodes in the Odyssey, at times rearranging or transforming the elements in the episodes, but they don't seem in the main an attempt to make the medium of painting somehow take on the shape of Homer's epic poem. O'Meally argues that the relationship between the Bearden series and the Odyssey is one ultimately of collaboration, in that it seems clear that Bearden's work is poised as a full-fledged participant in the telling of Odysseus' story. The collages, in other words, involve more than mere decoration or even translation, more than carrying the prior work's message into a new medium. I myself find it hard to use the term collaboration without simultaneity, whether in terms of process, that is, with multiple artists working together to make something, it's simultaneous in that you're putting it together at the same time, or in terms of reception, that is, with artworks in multiple media, whether or not they were made at the same time, nonetheless displayed or performed in conjunction in a manner that makes their reception unavoidably intermedial. But O'Mealy's main point here is that Bearden's work is not ancillary to Homer's epic, but self-contained and moreover interpretive and interventionist. Bearden's new works shed light on the ancient ones. Albright writes that in pseudomorphosis, making one artistic medium imitate or take the shape of another typically involves a certain wrenching or scraping against the grain of the original medium. He tends to interpret this as a type of violation or transgression of the original, which he recognizes creates a paradox in relation to his larger argument that an intermedial impulse is constitutive of the aesthetic itself. As he puts it, quote, "Art is not art unless capable of being transposed, but the transposition is never comprehensive or even correct, except with respect to a few contrived congruences." Another way to think about this, however, is as a motor of artistic innovation in terms of the second or target medium, the medium that you're taking the influence into. The process of pseudomorphosis can be a way to expand boundaries, to discover new possibilities, to transform a medium precisely by making it become other. This is certainly the case in African diasporic art. As I mentioned earlier, black writers, dancers, painters, and sculptors have habitually turned to the medium of music for models of formal experimentation, ways to expand or transgress their usual means of working. Writing of jazz-inspired literature in particular, editors Art Lang and Nathaniel Mackey have observed that, quote, "It is particularly unsurprising that a music which so frequently and characteristically aspires to the condition of speech, reflecting critically, it seems, upon the limits of the sayable, should have provoked and proved of enormous interest to practitioners of the word, writers. Black music, in other words, has long been taken to suggest strategies of innovation for other artistic media, ways of pressing against and extending the boundaries of expression." I want to mention one other model for thinking about the relationships among artistic media, not only because it derives from the jazz tradition itself, but also because it seems consonant with Bearden's repeated insistence that art itself was not so much a matter of mimesis, that is, one thing made to look like another, as a matter of relationality, and what he came to term, in a vocabulary derived from the painter Stuart Davis, the intervals of modern life. "Objects do not exist for me," Bearden once said, "except insofar as a rapport exists between them and myself. In other words, it's not the objects that matter to me, but what is in between them. It is this in-between that is the real subject of my pictures." I'm thinking of something I mentioned earlier, which I've written about at greater length elsewhere, Duke Ellington's use of the word parallel to describe his compositions. It's a term that Ellington used more than any other to describe his longer works, such as the 1951 A Tone Parallel to Harlem, and the 1943 New World A-Coming, which he described as a parallel to Roy Ottley's book of the same title, or Black, Brown, and Beige, his suite from 1943, which was originally called A Tone Parallel, and that he described as a tone parallel to the history of the American Negro. By the mid-40s, Ellington began to use the term parallel seemingly in order to specify the effects and requisites of musical transposition without relying on reference to another art form, as in tone poem, portrait, or translation. The term is sometimes used in a sense that connotes a kind of mimesis, aesthetic reflection, as in Music is My Mistress, where Ellington says that composers try to parallel observations made through all the senses. But Ellington's use of the term parallel usually avoids formalizing whatever that artistic reflection might involve. Parallel has interesting implications for an Ellingtonian understanding of the relation between music and literature in particular, since it offers a metaphor not of crossing, transferal, or import, much less grafting or mixing, but instead of simultaneous and equivalent movement through space and time. Ellington and Strayhorn seem to favor this sense of an exact match in development, a structure of reflection without primacy, in a term that implicitly respects the distances between expressive medium. I've written about this issue, especially in relation to Ellington's 1957, Such Sweet Thunder. I was playing a little bit of the title tune at the beginning when we were sitting down before the panel. It's a suite based on the works of Shakespeare. David Haydu has commented that Ellington Strayhorn in his suites, even when inspired by literary characters like in this one, doesn't try to write traditional descriptive music. Ellington himself writes in a press release for one concert performance of Such Sweet Thunder, and I should say it's sweet, S-W-E-E-T, not S-U-I-T-E, although I think you're meant to hear the pun, that, quote, in the suite, I'm attempting to parallel the vignettes of some of the Shakespearean characters in miniatures, sometimes to the point of caricature. Like Bearden's Odysseus suite, Ellington's Such Sweet Thunder is not quite a transposition. The suite doesn't place Shakespeare in Harlem, challenging our preconceptions about high and low art in the process. Instead, Such Sweet Thunder is above all a reading of Shakespeare, perhaps from Harlem, and an elaborate reading at that. In the liner notes to the album, Duke describes the title cut, featuring Ray Nance on trumpet, as the sweet and singing, very convincing story Othello told Desdemona. It must have been the most, because when her father complained and tried to have her marriage annulled, the Duke of Venice said that if Othello had said that to his daughter, she would have gone for it too. The point is that the speech of the seduction is not given in the play. Here, the music fills the silences or interstices of Shakespeare's work. It imagines what cannot be or is not given in the written language, aiming to capture in sound the enthralling effect of Othello's violent and bloody tales of his life as a soldier. And to do so, the music rhymes Othello with an entirely different moment from another play, as Barry Ulanov has noted. This is Ulanov. On stage, Ellington introduces each major work with a vagabond syntax that makes one wonder why he bothers. But if one listens carefully, both to the words and the music, one discovers why. One finds, for example, that entitling a piece about Othello with a quotation from A Midsummer Night's Dream, that's where the title comes from, I never heard so musical a discord, such sweet thunder, he has gone right to the root of Othello's problem. His blunt and jazzy explanation is probably closer to the substance of the play than the long and involuted commentaries of most Shakespeare scholars. I'm happy to repeat that as a 20th century literature scholar. I just want to dive into one example from the Odysseus suite to try to talk about this model of moving between artistic media, and then I'll stop. While I don't think that Bearden's Odysseus suite can quite be described as pseudomorphosis in the way Albright defines it, I do think that one can make an argument that it is structured as a certain sort of parallel in the Ellingtonian sense to Homer's epic poem. Bearden once wrote that, quote, a quality of artificiality must be retained in a work of art, since, after all, the reality of art is not to be confused with that of the outer world. Art, it must be remembered, is artifice, or a creative undertaking, the primary function of which is to add to our existing conception of reality. In the Odysseus series, the artifice has to do not only with what Bearden calls distortion of scale that we saw very much in the collage that Danielle was talking about in the block, those things out of proportion, and abstract coloration, but above all in this series, I think, with the collage method itself, especially with what one might describe as the deliberate crudity of the deployment of the shapes. Shapes bluntly cobbled together, often in a manner that exposes the white gaps between the colored forms. This is the Song of the Sirens image from the series. It seems to me that this technique is above all tactile, a way of emphasizing the trace of the human hand at work and the scale of the individual human body cutting and pasting. As a trace of the ineluctable embodiment of the artistic process, collage technique can be described as parallel to the strategies of collage composition in Homer's oral epic, in which the demands of embodied recitation of enormous amounts of text compelled the use of well-known repositories of formulae, such as the often mentioned rosy-fingered dawn, as mnemonic devices or landmarks, point de repère. In both, there are ways that the body shows up in the medium, in mnemonic devices in oral poetry on the one hand, and in the tactile quality of the hand in the collage on the other hand. I want to say a bit more before stopping about this painting, to talk about the kinds of parallels that Bearden is after. The Sirens Song seems an especially rich example, in part because it's an episode from Book 12 of the Odyssey that explicitly involves music. Odysseus' protector, Circe, has warned him against the sirens as enchanters, who entice passing voyagers with their music. She tells him to melt down sweet wax of honey, and with it stop your companions' ears, so none can listen, and then to have his sailors, quote, tie you hand and foot on the fast ship, standing upright against the mast with the rope's ends lashed around it, so that you can have joy in hearing the song of the sirens. So as his crew rows them by, Odysseus is lashed, so he won't be tempted to land and stay there, but can listen to the song. The power of the episode is derived from its evocation of an art, a sung poetry, that seduces to the point of peril. Hearing the sirens' music, we're told, is a pleasure so extreme that one cannot pull oneself away from it. Put in the terms I've been sketching here, one might say that the threat is that too much beauty annihilates temporality. The sailor exposed to it cannot go on. Thus the beach on the Sirens' Island is piled with bone heaps, the poem says, of men now rotted away. Too much beauty, in other words, a full saturation of any single medium, makes transposition impossible. In the epic poem, it's poignant that the antidote to overwhelming beauty is another sort of beauty, or beauty repurposed. If the Sirens' Song is repeatedly described as sweet, then Odysseus must stop up his crew's ears with sweet wax of honey. This subtlety is not conveyed in Bearden's collage, but the static nature of the picture, which distills the ship's tortured passing into one emblematic moment, only seems to emphasize the point that the threat here involves the stoppage of time. But I'm especially interested in the seemingly minor but significant discrepancies between the text of the Odyssey and Bearden's painting. The poem clearly indicates that the crew takes down the sails and rows past the Sirens' Island. But in the painting, the sail is still up, and there's only a single rudder extending from the ship. Moreover, in the poem, Odysseus is clearly tied up standing on the deck. But in the painting, he is lashed to the mast in the air, a limp body hung from a scaffold, if not lynched. On the one hand, as O'Mealy points out, the rationale for these transformations are in part what one could call painterly. That is, they have to do with the spatial and coloristic configuration of the collage medium. The white sail provides a backdrop and draws the eye to Odysseus' suspended body, whereas he would be hard to distinguish in the midst of the black bodies of the crew on the deck. On the other hand, however purely formal these rationales, the changes have other implications. The inclusion of the boom of the sail means that Odysseus is hung from a sort of cross. And in the context of New York in the 1970s, where these collages were made and first shown, it's hard not to sense in the motionless black body strung or lashed to the mast an echo of the terroristic American tradition of lynching. This is not to make Odysseus African American, whatever that would mean, nor is it to conflate these radically distant and cultural and historical contexts. But these minor transformations do suggest a subtle relation between them, or more precisely hint at a parallel, non-causal and non-mimetic relation across an unbreached distance. It's above all a matter of the treacherous proximity between an aesthetic transport on the one hand and violent submission on the other. In African American literature, other works come to mind that attempt to explore this extremely complex space, such as Jean Toomer's poem Portrait in Georgia, in which a white southern feminine beauty is a metonym for a violated black male body, hair braided chestnut coiled like a lyncher's rope. Or the letter in Nathaniel Mackey's Bedouin Horn Book about singer Al Green's falsetto, where the narrator comments, "I've long marveled at how all his going on about love succeeds in alchemizing a legacy of lynchings, as though singing were a rope he comes eternally close to being strangled by." Very complex overlapping of ideas, and I think you can find other instances where this intermedial space is engaged. I've written about and have a great deal to say about Paris blues, and I would have gone there. If we have time, if we have any time for discussion, I will maybe say a little bit about Paris blues, but it's because it's a different animal. I'm going to stop here with those comments on intermediality and comparative arts and the Odysseus series. Thanks.